So, today's debate, is social media good for democracy? We interpret that as to say, is the world a more democratic place with social media? We address this through three contentions. The first contention, social media is not just about free speech, but also it promotes freedom of assembly. The Black Lives Matter movement would not have happened without Twitter. The Women's March movement, that would not have happened without Facebook. And the student survivors of the Parkland shooting, they would not have been able to make their voices heard without social media. Now, the impact of this is people whose voices were once silenced can now make actual change. For instance, the students of the Parkland shooting. There is a new rifle law in Florida that has changed thanks to those high school students. High schoolers were able to make an actual change. People younger than you, due to social media. Now in Florida, to buy a rifle, there is a 3-day waiting period, and they bumped the age up so that you have to be 21. The women's rights issues have been brought to light, and racism against the black community has been introduced to people who might not have known or heard about it before. Free speech comes out through those protests, and change is made. The second contention is those who are nervous to share their opinions find out that they are not alone. This is a term that is known as pluralistic ignorance. It's the belief that one is alone in one's views, when in reality, everyone has been collectively silenced. According to Zeynep Tufriki of the MIT Technology Review, that is the reason that social media has formatted so many different rebellions. Rebellions such as this can be seen as an example in Arab Springs, where there was a series of rebellions across the Middle East in late 2010. It began in Tunisia as a response to oppressive regimes and a low standard of living. According to the Arab Spring page on Wikipedia, social media is the driving force behind current political revolutions throughout the world. The impact of this is that political uprisings are able to happen in oppressive countries. This is another example of the impacts from the first contention, yet it shows that it works even in other countries outside of the United States. Our third contention is that social media allows people to be more politically active. For instance, candidates in the last election were able to directly reach out to young people who might only have been getting their news from biased news sources. A warrant for this. Let's take a look at Bernie Sanders' campaign. A large part of his campaign was done through social media, and that's how he gained a lot of support from millennials. The impact of this is that young people on social media who are just scrolling through their phones all the time can find out things about candidates directly from the source rather than going through biased news sources. For instance, young people, they might not watch the presidential debates. They're more interested with Instagram, or Twitter. So when one of the presidential candidates who is running for president comes through, they have their own account and they can post things. And Bernie Sanders took a lot of advantage to this. So what he did was he knew that young people were on their phones all the time on social media. So he was able to gain a lot of support from young people. Thank you.
First, I want to thank everyone so much for being here and coming to this activity. I think this is an amazing moment to demonstrate to all of you what a civil discussion looks like. And then we can have these types of discussions in our society on these controversial issues, and we can discuss these things in this type of space. Without further procrastinating and stalling for time, let's get down to it. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about today is what's called it was something that's perpetuated through social media, something that's called the us-them narrative, right? You have false information that gets spread through social media. You have divisive headline articles that are created and published specifically for profit. Their entire goal is to create a divisive environment. This is something that's called micro-targeting, where different political and profit-motivated companies will target very specific individuals on Facebook with hyper-specific ads. This is a process that is becoming rapidly increasing as new technology develops to make it easier. As this narrative increases, we also see things like internet trolls pop up on Facebook. You see things like 4chan, and then the even farther right 8chan that pop up that are just full of internet trolls that attack with harmful rhetoric. This can be seen all throughout Twitter. You can see this on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Twitter feed, where you have people constantly being super aggressive. You see this on other politicians' active feeds as well. This creates an us-them narrative where inevitably we always view people on the internet as an aggressor, as they are against us. They are not an individual person, but they are an entity who is ideologically opposed. Then you no longer see them as a human. You see them as someone who you should disagree with. This, at the end of the day, destroys the humanistic aspect in communication. That when you talk to someone, you see them as an individual rather than a thing. This gets broken down through social media when we no longer have these conversations in front of that are happening. The other thing that I want to talk about is surveillance, and that social media is constantly used to surveil normal people with these same political political and profit-motivated companies. You see government agencies like the NSA using Facebook and Twitter to track down undocumented immigrants, with ICE raids happening in all across the nation that are targeted and found through social network and through other social networking platforms as well. You can see that you have Russian cybernauts coming in and using Facebook and divisive advertisements to, again, constantly see what our opinions are and create these micro-targeted ads. Again, this furthers that us-them narrative that's happening, and it furthers this division that's happening in our society. So now let's talk a little bit about what Ford brought up. One of the first things he brought up in his speech was that it creates a democratic place. He talks about how there you have different grassroots movements like the Black Lives Matter and the Parkland survivors. But you still see that they're affected by this narrative that happens. You can see that 2 of the Parkland survivors have since committed suicide because of harmful bullying that was happening online. This isn't being used. While yes, it can be used for beneficial, to have many beneficial aspects, it's currently not. It's being used to harm our society, and it's being used to create a very harmful narrative against unique individuals. Second, when they talk about, he talks about pluralistic ignorance. He talks about how people think that they have been collectively silenced. And again, he talks about how social media was a driving force behind revolutions. He talked again, bringing up the Arab Springs. Now, social media was a big influencer in the Arab Springs. But alternatively, it works on the other way as well. You see harmful actors like Roger Stone, the campaign manager behind Donald Trump, as well as the campaign manager behind many infamous presidents like Nixon as well, that have learned to use these social media platforms to create harmful division. Yes, they recognize that you have been collectively silenced, and they use that to your advantage to create this narrative that everyone else is the enemy. They use this to further this narrative that everyone else has an agenda against you that ultimately causes more harm to our society. Finally, he talks about political activism. The younger millennials will come up and through social media have a longer access to political activism. And this is seen through a lot of lens, whether it's changing your Facebook profile to match whatever side you believe in the recent activities that are going on. I'm sure a lot of you at one point had a French flag on your profile for the terrorist attacks that were happening in Paris. We see the shooting that happened in Finland not too long ago as well. But that doesn't change the fact that Facebook still ends up spreading more misinformation that ends up harming this political activism. You see things like Flat Earth Society pages on Facebook popping up. You see things like the Flat Earth Facebook pages popping up, and as well you have different political actors releasing statements through their own personal media outlets. You can see that Donald Trump released a tweet advertising for transgender bans in the military through his personal account. This doesn't seem very problematic at first until you realize that Donald Trump as a person has the ability and has in the past blocked several people through his personal account. When this is being used as an official political decree, this ends up hurting political activism because less people have the ability to see these statements that are being put out because they're on personal accounts that are not mandated by government control but rather through private use. So at the end of the day, what you see is that social media is hurting our society and causing more division than we had before the mainstream use of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.
Hi, how's it going? So with your first point, you mentioned how Donald Trump was in a group point blocked social media people. In an actual tweet, he was sued by another person, one of the accounts that would follow him and did not like what he had to say, because him blocking people and him being actually being president involves blocking people's First Amendment rights. So he was actually sued, and the court went in favor of the lady who said that that she blocked his tweet because that is in order violating the First Amendment rights. So social media platforms have a certain they have actual certain, like, what's the word for it? They have certain certain methods of use where users aren't allowed to block people if it's violating their their First Amendment. So this lady actually won, and in return is able to tweet because that is her First Amendment right, and certain people also was worried about what you have to say about that as well. But in the other point you said, freedom of assembly, like the Black Matter movement, voices are heard through social media, and social media is in fact positive for democracy because people are able to get their voices heard. And you mentioned how the us-them narrative is in a way negative, but in reality, democracy needs negative and positive voices to be heard. That's just how it works. Like, people have to be able to say that they agree with something. People have to say that they negatively disagree with something. Just because certain people are creating negative voices for profit doesn't mean that the positive outcomes of people using social media to actually cause change and cause betterness for the whole world in itself shouldn't be ignored. You know, the positives outweigh the negatives in a way like better matter. Like, voices are not actually making change. Like, these young people that you talked about before, saying that how they create these activist pages, they're doing it in order to cause change because their voices were silenced before. But through social media, they're actually able to get their voices heard, and not just that, but they're able to cause people to come together, support their activities, and also in another cause changes in itself. And then another to what you said how surveillance monitors through people like the NSA, they track down people, and they have like ICE raids and they're targeted like Russian cybernetics. That's not directly related to what this is talking about, how social media is good for democracy. That's just one negative or country that's using not even using social media, that's using their own technological advances to hack into our social media platforms for their own benefit. So in reality, that's not really accurate or related to what we're talking about in this debate about why social media is good for democracy. Furthermore, it's decisions in society through social media, like presidents that aren't really talking positively, where everybody could express their opinions about the presidents. And even if the presidents aren't even allowed to block people, like I mentioned earlier, from expressing their opinions about him, because that's blocking their own First Amendment rights. The roles of such social media are basically for the entrepreneurship of people, for businesses here in the country. Most people in this age now have used social media for benefits of increasing their own business and also increasing what they believe is right. Social media is used as a way to get people to actually have their opinions heard. Social media is used as a way for businesses to explore and get supporters behind them. Activists use social media as a way for people to get their voices heard and to show, like, oh, we actually feel this certain way. We have our voices and we have something to say. So social media is so good for democracy that without social media in this light, we won't actually be able to be the country that we say we are. There's other countries out there where they have no form of social media and no form of where they can actually like have their opinions heard, and they're under dictatorship. So what you're saying with how social media is bad and the impacts of it are negative and it creates an us, them theory is true, but if there is no social media, we wouldn't even have the ability to say they're us, they're them. We'll just be trapped in a box where we wouldn't be able to really even express our opinions in the first place. Thank you.
So, when we're speaking about democracy, it's basically founded on the idea that you respect your opponents and you give them the ability to speak to you, and you can speak to them, you know, calmly and pretty nicely. So, this is not supported by social media. We can see that through third person and anonymous platforms that do not, you don't have to express yourself through yourself. You can only say things that do not have, you don't have to own up to what you believe in. And this, this does not aid in an effective communication with other people. It also, you can,
Sorry.
you're good. This is warranted through cyberbullying. As you can see, it's pretty rampant amongst our society. It is common among young people, and it can branch up to higher spectrums like the government itself. We've seen high-profile people do things that are not completely appropriate for what you would assume they would be. Another reason would be this creates an alienation and hostility amongst the people in these places, and as a whole, it just makes society less civil towards one another. Another reason would be misinformation, mass information spread towards people. Social media sites use algorithms to find out exactly how and what you want to hear, and this is completely negative towards people's opinions, because as we know, branching out your mindset and your ideas is much more beneficial than just hearing the exact same thing and supporting your points over and over, as we see happens in echo chambers. So, echo chambers don't allow people to have any fact-checking or truth testing, and they just continuously say the same things, and there's no diversity in intellectualism. So this creates radical people who don't have any other opinions other than the ones that they continuously hear. So as you said, voices are heard, and that's true, and people are allowed to accumulate their opinions and come together, but that can also have some serious negative repercussions, because if you're coming together with people, like I said, who have the exact same opinions as you, it can, of course, result with very good systems of change, but it can also result in radical people who only want negatives to occur on the others that they don't exactly support or like. Another reason would be people can so people can gain supporters, but it might not always be the right kind of supporters if you're giving misinformation and false information. Okay, that's all I have to say.
All right. So you have two worlds presented to you today. In one world, the affirmatives, they present to you a social media platform where we can have engaging discussions, where we can create new ideas, where we can engage in a democratic fashion. Unfortunately, none of that actually happens when we have a society overrun by people who would rather engage in divisive, aggressive, us-them, in this us-them narrative that's spread through these profit-motivated companies. You have people who are always going to want to engage in aggressive manners rather than engage in a democratic civil conversation. This ultimately is always going to be the harm of social media. You see these things happen everywhere, and this is one of the reasons why this narrative is always going to be harmful. The other big reason why this is going to be more, and this is why none of these conversations actually happen on social media. The other big thing, and this is what the affirmative forgot to discuss, was surveillance. Did you know that constantly on Snapchat they tell you exactly where your location is? This is information that, while is secure, cybersecurity is always an issue that needs to be fixed, and it isn't protected by everyone. This is how we have these these offensive cybernaut actors that come in and find this information and use it for harm. That's how you get these people using the information that you post on Facebook to get micro-targeted ads to feed into this us-them narrative. Yes, if this narrative did not exist, then it would be a wonderful thing. But unfortunately, because of this narrative, social media conversations will always ultimately digress to harmful ad hominem attacks that do nothing but bog down the system. And this is why we believe that social media probably does more harm for democracy. Thank you.
At the end of the day, this debate comes down to one simple thing. Does the affirmative team or the negative team have bigger impacts when it comes to whether democracy is better with social media? Today, the affirmative provided three contentions. The first being about free speech, promoting freedom of assembly, with an impact of peoples whose voices were once silenced can now be heard through forms of the Women's March, Black Lives Matter, and the Parkland shooting. The second contention was those who are nervous to share those opinions find out that they are not alone. I discussed this through the term pluralistic ignorance, which is the belief that one is alone in one's views when in reality everyone has been collectively silenced. The impact to that contention was that political uprisings are able to happen in oppressive countries. This is another example of an impact from the first contention, but it shows that it even works in countries that are not the United States. And the third contention that I used in my first speech was that social media allows people to be more politically active, and candidates can directly reach young people, and the young people are not going through directly biased news sources. I would like to remind so if you compare the impacts that my partner and I have to the impacts that our opponents have, you can see clearly that our impacts are greater, and that is why it is clear that social media is good for democracy. And I think So, is the world a more democratic place with social media? Yes. Political uprisings and new movements in general that have been sparked through social media and been rallied behind it have taken place. And in response to my opponent's argument about there being false information on Facebook that young people were getting, Mark Zuckerberg recently put in a task force of over 20,000 people to take down false information, and 1.3 billion fake accounts were deleted, along with hundreds of pages created by foreign governments. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I want you all in the audience to take a moment, and I want you to think about the ways that social media has influenced you. It's probably been on more levels, or in a bigger way anyways, outside of democracy, but I'm sure that all of you have been influenced in some way, shape, or form in the way that you've been involved in either politics or not involved in politics because of the influence that you've had in social media. And so I want you to think for a moment about what the debate was about tonight, but I also want you to think about your personal experiences. And I would like you to tell me, anyone out there in the audience, tell me whether you agree with the affirmative or the negative, and perhaps add in your own personal viewpoints about how social media has influenced you as an individual. Yeah.
So, I've shared probably like 5 things recently that somebody else, one of my friends, have commented, and they've actually found it on the internet that is completely false.
Mm. And when you share them, do you point out that it's false?
They will comment on my posts and point it out for me, so I think those side with them.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of bias in news that's shared on social media.
Okay. All right. What? Any others? How many people have posted something and later been told or later found out that it was false information? I'm raising my own hand right now because I had somebody tell me, yeah. I'm shocked that the rest of you haven't done that, or do you just not share things? Because there's a lot of stuff out there that is not true, and maybe you don't realize some of the things that you share that are false. There's a lot of false information out there. So how do we check back against that as participants in our democracy? How do you check back against fake news? Do research. How do you know whether the research you're doing is good or bad?
Check resources.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Check where the news is coming from and what, like, any credibility or bias on it.
Okay, so how do we decide whether something is credible or not? That's great, because that's what most people say, right? Go to credible news sources. How do you know whether news sources are credible or not? Yeah.
I think you can usually tell just because if something is a credible source, it usually tries to share both sides of
Okay.
a certain position.
Mhm.
And sometimes you can tell when articles or stuff like that is completely biased, and so you can try to narrow out your research to.
Okay, so I think you're focused kind of on the tone of the writing. So if the tone is very kind of exaggerated towards one side, maybe you can kind of have a red flag go up that maybe this is false news.
Is the news reporting facts with citations to where they got these facts, or are they speaking more of an opinion within the piece?
Okay, and so if you look at newspapers, they don't really have citations. How do you determine whether a newspaper is giving you facts or just opinions?
Look up their claims yourself.
Okay, yeah, and usually they're interviewing someone, so you can look at who they're interviewing and maybe go back and look them up. All right, but yeah, one-sidedness, tone is a big issue in social media and the way that media and news is forecasted, who they're interviewing or who is doing that writing. What is a method outside of just academics? So how do you know whether something is academic or not? Y'all are in college. How do you decide whether something is appropriate for your college assignments? No instructors have told you? They're just like, go out and find some information. I don't care where it's from.
peer-reviewed journals, right?
Okay, yeah, so academics has this thing called peer-reviewed journals, right? Does anybody know what that term means? Yeah, in the back.
It's been read by several, pertaining to like the field, it's been read by several people who are experts.
Yeah, exactly. Every journal has an editorial board made up of experts in that particular area, and they read over that research and kind of ask questions and make sure. Oftentimes goes through a revision process that is quite lengthy, which is why academic journals often have very long publication dates. So you'll see an article get published that's actually talking about something that happened 2 years ago because it's taken them 2 years to get through that publication process. So academic journals are considered to be relatively protected from people just outright lying about things. Has that ever happened though? Have people published in academic journals and outright lied about things? Yes, they have. It's just much less likely to happen because there's a number of people who are checking on those things. But it does happen. So then what's the next level of publication? Does anybody know? So you've got peer-reviewed journals. Those are considered relatively protected against people lying. What's the next level? How do we check against it at the next level of writing? What are some other sources that teachers tell you are decent sources to get if you can't get academic journals? Does anybody know? Yeah.
My teachers have told me to use websites that end in like edu or .gov.
Okay. All right, so .edu, .govs are some way of telling, .edus are educational institution publications, .govs are government publications. Somebody in the back had their hand up? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say database sources,
Okay, what do you mean by that?
like the actual university website have like actual sources that you can look up to.
Okay, so your library has these databases of information, and typically those are somewhat, you know, gone through and made sure that those are respectable sources of information or they wouldn't appear in that database. Yeah, I think that's a good way of going about it. You all have free access to that, which is great and not always the case for other people. So using the databases is a way to get newspapers, magazines, more mainstream publications that all have some kind of editing capability. So they have somebody who looks over the information, somebody who's fact checking the information. That information is just not going out without any protections. So there's a number of different ways that you can look at information and make sure that it is valid information. But valid information can still be, what were you guys saying over here? What's wrong? Even if it's valid information, how can it be filtered?
Micro-targeting.
Yeah, what is that?
Micro-targeting is when like different certain actors will try and direct very specific advertisements to very specific people. I'm sure during like Chico elections, you were getting a lot of very specific advertisements about like vote for X person for mayor. Who was it? Lamalfa?
City Council,
City Council.
and that was our Congress people. Although they probably weren't getting that because they don't live in our district. So you all are probably from outside of Chico area. But yeah, you probably during the elections got a lot of news feeds that you didn't typically see from your local news sources that were targeting you because of where you list where you live. So you get certain advertisements because of where you live. And those are called micro-targeting. So you get influenced, even though those are legitimate news sources, you still get influenced. But this side says, what about that? Why isn't that a destruction of democracy?
Because regardless, in the political system we live in, politicians are going to lie and put out fake news for their benefit. It doesn't necessarily mean that social media is bad in the first place, because people are going to lie about their profile, or they're going to like catfish your profile regardless. But there's still people out there who have real profiles, and still real politicians out there who are trying to speak the truth the best way they can.
Okay, so, and access is important, right? So I think what the affirmative side is saying is that y'all are responsible, in some parts, to make sure that you are filtering information yourself and not allowing your social media to do that for you. That you are looking at the things that Adam just talked about, that you are looking at who is advertising, and you're looking at whether you actually support that person, or whether that person is familiar to you simply because you see their face more often. Because that's what advertising is really all about, right? Brand recognition. And politicians are no different than the clothes that you wear. They want you to recognize their name when you go vote because you're more likely to mark their name down, whether you know what they stand for or not. So y'all are responsible in some ways because social media is probably not going away. And it is going to influence your decision making, whether you like it or not, unless you just don't use it. Which, how many of you don't have a smartphone? Yeah, that's what I thought. So all of you are going to use it in some way. All of you are going to be accessed by these individuals, whether good or bad, trying to influence you. And democracy really stands on our capabilities as citizens in good decision making. So even though social media may come with some ills, you also can't get away from it. So you have to be able to filter through those ills and get to the good of it. Okay? All right. Hopefully, I would like all of you to give a round of applause for our debaters. As you leave here, if nothing else, you're thinking more about your social media use and the way that it influences you. Make sure you check out on the way out. Line up and be patient, please. There's only one checkout spot.